Niall Ferguson is here. He is an economic historian. He is a professor at Harvard. He is an author. You may also be familiar with his documentaries, which are broadcast on PBS. His writings about the economic crisis and a potential rupture in U.S.-China relations have received much attention and controversy. His most recent book is now in paperback. It is called The Ascent of Money, A Financial History of the World. I am pleased to have him back at this table. Welcome. Although it was a different table that we still use. This is a little smaller table for more intimacy.
Did you throw it at someone?
Yeah, we turned it over on them.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, economic recovery in the United States last quarter, 3.5% growth. Is there a global economic recovery underway?
I think there's a global economic recovery which looks actually rather more sustainable than the U.S. recovery. Most of the U.S. recovery is in the form of stimulus from government, the Cash for Clunkers program and the encouragement to first-time home buyers. That accounted for a really large percentage, more
Less than 50.
Pretty close to half. If you add those two things together, and then the rest of it has to do with inventories. I don't think this is a sustainable recovery yet. The recession is technically over, but I will be very surprised if the next quarter's numbers are as good, because these programs are expiring or have expired. The global recovery is more interesting because China, and not only China, also India and Brazil, plus a whole bunch of other mainly Asian economies, are growing much faster than I think anybody would have predicted 6 months ago. Not many people back in the dark days of the spring thought that even China would bounce back this strongly. But with growth now at an annual rate of around 10%, and interestingly consumer growth in China growing even faster than that, there is clearly a global recovery. But the engine of growth is not the United States. For the first time, and one might say in a century, the engine of growth in the world economy is no longer the United States.
But it hasn't been the United States for a number of years.
No, the engine of growth in the world economy was China plus the United States in the last 10 years. But it was very much China plus the United States. You can actually figure this out if you look at the decade running up to the crisis, so 1998 to 2007, 2/5 of total growth in the world economy was China plus America. But of that 2/5, the United States was the lion's share, just because it's still the biggest economy in the world.
And how much of it has to do with the Chinese stimulus?
A lot, because that, in relative terms, is a very, very big shot in the arm of China's economy. Plus, China's stimulus has kind of worked better. It turns out that you can have Keynesian policies. Well, yeah, right. You can have Keynesian policies where you aim to stimulate demand through massive government expenditure financed by borrowing more easily in a controlled economy than in an open economy like that of the United States, which is a point, incidentally, that Keynes made in the 1930s. If you look at the foreword to the general theory, the 1936 classic, in the German edition, Keynes says that the policies he recommends of deficit-financed government pump priming will work better in a controlled totalitarian economy than in a free, open economy, and that's still true today.
So what's the sort of your own sense of the American economy over the next 2 or 3 years?
Well, I'm relatively pessimistic about how fast growth is going to be. The administration earlier this year forecast that the economy would grow next year by 3.5%, then by 4%, then by 4.5% after that. I think that's highly unlikely to happen. My guess is that the economy will grow in real terms at closer to 2% a year for the next few years. And the reason I think that is that the U.S. consumer just can't bounce back in the way that we've been used to seeing in previous recessions. We've reached the limits of leverage on household balance sheets. When you've got debts that are equivalent to around 120% of personal disposable income, there's just no way that you can go back out to the shopping mall, even if the credit card companies were cutting you some slack, which they're not. So I think if the U.S. consumer is essentially going to be behaving in a parsimonious, even thrifty way, there's no way that the U.S. economy can grow at the rates that we've seen in the past.
But is that the bind we're caught in? On the one hand, we've been living in this consumption society where China and other places have been a saving economy, and now we need to be a consumption economy to fuel our economy, even though in the long term we need to be a saving economy.
I think this is the problem, and there's no way that you can have the old-style debt-fueled consumption that was at the heart of our growth really over the last 20 years once you reach this level of indebtedness. So that game is over, and we're in the process of a huge global rebalancing, which requires Americans to become more thrifty and requires Asians to become rather more profligate. We need the Chinese to go out shopping. We need them to get into some debt.
But that's their concern, whether they have created a domestic demand that will replace the international demand for what they manufacture.
Gradually, they are moving in that direction, but you can't do that sort of thing overnight. There is some evidence. I was in Hong Kong recently talking about this to people who are expert about the Chinese consumer. There is some evidence that they are actually going out and shopping. There's a bit of a myth, actually, that the Chinese households are big savers. That's not actually true. Most of the saving that goes on in the Chinese economy is by corporations who make more money than they know what to do with. So actually, Chinese households are beginning to save less, and they are going out and they are spending more. But, you know, you can't transform a culture as thrifty as China's in the space of a few months. This will take years to unfold.
The key to the Chinese economy is creating a demanding middle class.
Right. You need, in the end, to switch China's manufacturing production to domestic demand and away from foreign demand. The Chinese model has been export-driven, really for decades now, but particularly for the last 10 years. They focused on getting a bigger and bigger market share, and particularly of the US consumer market, but also the European consumer market. And they did this by keeping their currency weak. And, of course, they did it by becoming ever more
despite
productive.
Enormous pressure on the part of the United States and others to get them to.
And this pressure achieved nothing. On the contrary, when the crisis struck, China cancelled all the slight appreciation that they'd allowed and reverted to a straight dollar peg. Now, that's really, really important, Charlie, because one way that the US can get itself going again is by letting the dollar weaken, because that will stimulate US exports, and that's something that unofficially, tacitly, has become American policy. But the Chinese are piggybacking on that.
You will never see a politician say that.
Oh, they're all in favour of the strong dollar.
Exactly.
And the more you hear them say that they're in favour of the strong dollar,
the more you know they want a weak dollar.
The more you know the dollar's going down. So that's an old and long-established American practice. It goes back to the 1970s when John Connolly, who was Richard Nixon's Treasury Secretary, said to the Europeans of the dollar, "Our currency, your problem." We're doing it again this time around. It's yet another dollar devaluation designed to get the economy going. But the Chinese are piggybacking on this because, in effect, if we go down, the currency of China, the renminbi, goes down too. So interestingly, China is not only growing its own domestic demand, actually it's also building up its export market share again. Anybody who's on the wrong side of that process, like the Europeans with their increasingly strong euro, or the Japanese with the strong yen, is getting killed, because the Chinese are just killing their manufacturing exports.
All right, let's talk about how the prospect for America, because you make these terrifying analogies to the British Empire. You know, that our best days are behind us. That Chimerica, which was a grand bargain, is going to fall apart, that our dollar will not be the reserve currency, that we're looking at a deficit that is out of control.
Well,
so
I think
we should just give up.
One should always, one should never give up. That's an important thing to bear in mind. But one should always be aware of British historians predicting the decline of the United States. Right. My old friend Paul Kennedy did this in the late 1980s, and of course it was the Soviet Union.
The end of America, whatever his phrase was with that book.
I think that one has to look very carefully at the problems that the United States faces and draw analogies with great caution. But let me just put it this way.
But you do it.
Well, I do it with caution. Let me just put it this way. At the end of World War II, the United Kingdom was as indebted in relation to its gross domestic product as the United States is today. If you include private debt, most of Britain's debt was public debt. Today, the United States has a huge mountain of private and public debt. And the public debt mountain is getting bigger very fast indeed, with a $9 trillion cumulative deficit over the next 10 years. There's no question that that's unsustainable. I don't think anybody, even Paul Krugman, who loves deficits, would acknowledge that that is an unsustainable path.